Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your really busy work schedules to be here with us on this Wednesday night. We really appreciate it. My name is Taylor Nicole Rogers. I'm the Financial Times U.S. Labor and Equality Correspondent, and I'm going to be your moderator for tonight's conversation on the role of unions in newsrooms. I know you all do not need me to tell you that our industry is in a bit of a tough spot at the moment. There are seemingly endless layoffs and reorganizations and cost cuts, and that makes it more valuable than ever before to have an advocate on your side in your newsroom. What we're here to discuss tonight is if a labor union could be that advocate. We've got an all-star panel here with us to talk through all of this, all of the ins and outs and questions. So allow me to go ahead and introduce them. First, from the London Stock Exchange Group, we have senior reporter April Joyner. The News Guild's Director of Collective Bargaining, Danielle Newsom, also joins us. And last but certainly not least, we have Stephanie Brumsey, a segment producer from MSNBC. Before we get started, I also wanted to go ahead and let you know that all of our panelists are going to be taking your questions at the end of tonight's conversation. So start going ahead and getting those ready. And we're going to take those through the Q&A box, not the chat box. So I'll let you know when to start putting those in, but start getting those ready. So without further ado, let's get into it. Danielle, I wanted to start with you. Can you give us a brief overview of the role that unions play in newsrooms today?
Thank you, Taylor. So please cut me off if I go too long. I'm a bit of a labor nerd, but the News Guild was founded in 1933 to fight for issues like better pay, benefits, and reasonable workloads for journalists. And even though a lot has changed in almost 100 years, I can tell you that we often find those are still amongst the top issues for journalists and other media workers when they organize. But a more recent focus that underpins a lot of workplace issues is the fight for equity. So a lot of journalists are frustrated about the lack of diversity and large pay inequities that exist in their newsrooms and recognize that forming a union is often the best way to disrupt those entrenched structures. If we think about the SPJ Code of Ethics, it speaks to accountability, transparency, and minimizing harm. But how can you hold your publisher accountable to those standards if you yourself as a worker feel like you don't have a voice behind you and other colleagues behind you? And also, how can a publisher be accountable and transparent and minimize harm if it's not hiring journalists who reflect the community? So these are important issues that may not come front of mind when someone thinks about a union, but an example is the LA Times Guild a few years ago did a pay equity study that ultimately led to a class action lawsuit that was settled for $3 million. These pay equity studies have been done by the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, and other papers across the country. And the News Guild is actually working to expand that effort and do a nationwide pay study so we can highlight these issues and tackle them. But unions also provide an avenue to fight for other improvements beyond just pay. That can be contractual protections to preserve your ability to just do your job without some of the let's say, unfettered limbs of management getting in the way. So putting structures in place like just cause. In the introduction, Taylor, you mentioned layoffs. Union contracts are a great place to outline what should happen if there need to be layoffs. So these are just some of the protections, but ultimately, the role of unions in newsrooms is to bring together workers who make the report possible so you can hold management accountable. And I know we're always stronger together. So unions are just a way to do that collectively.
Danielle, that all sounds amazing, but I have to ask you kind of the question of the moment. We're getting ready to enter a new presidential administration, which we're not expecting to be a friend of labor unions. Is any of that going to change? Are we going to be able to organize in the same way that unions have in the past?
Well, with a second Trump administration, it's going to be more emboldened and might actually be more effective at changing the laws to make them less worker friendly, to pass anti-union legislation to roll back protections that currently exist. So that could happen, but it will take time. In order to change laws, to change administrative agencies, there's still processes that have to go through. And unions have never relied on the law as our main source of power. It's about coming together and taking collective action. And I can tell you, during the first Trump administration, we saw a wave of union activity. The summer of 2018, there were teacher strikes in red states like there'd never been before. In the News Guild in 2018, we had new organizing in 25 different workplaces. And by 2020, the last year of the Trump administration, 48 new unions formed under the News Guild. So a lot of union organizing happened during that time. If economic conditions changed and more people see unions as an avenue to push back against them, we'll be here. Unions are here to bring people together and fight, and more people might be inspired to join in that kind of effort under the incoming administration.
Yeah, we'll certainly be keeping an eye out for that. April, I want to come to you now because before you were in your current role at LSEG, you were a leader in the union at Business Insider, and you were there when it was actually formed. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how a newsroom changes when it unionizes for the first time.
Yes, thanks for that. So yeah, I started out at Business Insider in 2021, and the union went public with its drive a few months after I joined. So I wasn't part of the original organizing committee, but I became a steward later that year. So one of the biggest things is this concept that's known as status quo, which means that once the union, well, I should say first there was a vote to unionize and it passed overwhelmingly. Most people, 90+% voted to unionize. So once that was ratified, the unit was ratified, there's a term known as status quo, which means that the company cannot change material worker conditions without bargaining with the union. And so that can be different for a lot of companies where the management is generally used to having, we want to make this change, this goes into effect without necessarily discussing it with workers. And so that was a big change, especially at a place like Insider that had a very startup atmosphere, even though it was past the startup stage, but it still kind of had that environment. So it was good for the newsroom in that people felt more emboldened to bring up things that they had as far as concerns with how things were done, like changes to schedules, things around compensation for overtime or days worked, like on holidays and such. So people felt more empowered to talk about those things where otherwise they might have felt scared because, this is what the company says, and if you don't go along with it, you might feel like your job is at risk. But working together as a union, you felt more empowered to bring up things like, okay, this is how this could make not only my personal position better, but better for the newsroom overall.
Thanks for sharing that experience, April. That's really interesting. But Stephanie, I want to come to you next because you were a part of the union at Reuters before you were at MSNBC, right? Like, how does that compare to what it's like to work in a newsroom that has been unionized for a really long time?
Hi, thanks for having me tonight. It is in so many ways it is the same, and in so many ways it's different. I was also on the organizational committee for getting the union together here at MSNBC, and it was an interesting an interesting journey. And a lot of the drive for me to be in that position was because I was in the union at Reuters, and I understood and really benefited from the protections that were in place with the News Guild at Reuters. The differences are many. Most of them are because of how settled the union is at Reuters. Everyone knows there's a union. Everybody knows how it works. People understand what situations they need to go to, or who to go to as a shop steward, whether it be on the management side or on the union side, in order to talk about the protections or what needs to be uh, uh, addressed because of the protections that we have with the union. Whereas at MSNBC, I often find myself having conversations with people like, "Oh, wait, you should talk to somebody first." And I'm currently a shop steward, so I'm typically the somebody, but but it has been a learning curve. A lot of it is because most journalists, especially these the new people in our shop, they've never been in a union, right? Like, unions are almost fairy tales, unfortunately, in our industry, where they're becoming more plentiful, but still, not as robust as it could be. So it's a lot of just like learning on a curve. What exactly is collective bargaining, and how can we use it to our benefit? What benefits do we actually have underneath the union? How can we put these in place, and how can we communicate that with them? And just simple things like that. The union hasn't even been in place for a year yet. So we are truly in our infancy. And I think that is the biggest difference, thus far between the two. And it's one we're going to be clinging to. Things are shaking up quite insanely at MSNBC right now. So we'll see how things work out.
Yeah, so we've heard. I want to ask you also, can you give us examples of those situations in which you would bring to a union steward?
Yeah, yes, I can. Like any situations where a manager is like, "Hey, I want to talk to you real quick about," or you think you might be having disciplinary action, or you get a random a summons from HR, right? Whether you do or don't know what they're talking about, and you want to address that, or if you have any gripes with colleagues or management, or questions about the usage of overtime, because now we get overtime or comp days. I mean, there are just so many things, the protections thereof. People who are worried about whether or not we're going to have to need like things like severance, and how does that work, right? And simply just being able to ask questions of someone who can speak to management in a way that they can actually get answers. That is extremely helpful. So those are the things that come my way as the current shop steward. It goes from like itty bitty to like, I don't know that answer, I'm going to have to email a lawyer person. Yeah.
I promise I'm not picking on you, but one more
Please do.
follow-up question. Okay, a lot of us on this panel right now work in print/digital. You work in television. Is it different at all in the way that the union operates in that newsroom?
Well, yes and no. I think the biggest difference is I, I think the biggest difference is the difference that we all experience because we all work in news, which is the idea of like deadlines and like what our workday actually looks like. And when you're in TV and news breaks, right? You hold on for a few hours, sometimes, more than a few hours, and that changes a lot of things. Those are the small differences, the small that becomes large differences. Working in television, I find as the biggest differences between when I was working at Reuters and like working on TV. And then speaking specifically to, the situation with MSNBC, we are juggling like this trifecta of issues, which is just like the very much changing industry that is the news industry. Then we have the very real impending threats of like Steve Bannon issuing threats to, sue the entirety of like the production staff at MSNBC, and whether or not we're going to survive that. And then we have, today's news that like NBC is no longer going to be the parent company of MSNBC. And like, what does that mean? Right. So we've been having like that fun rainbow of developments, but thankfully, it's something that I literally will email the WGAE and just go, hey, what does this mean? Are we still covered? And, in each case, as it were, and as it may, we are, as the time, as it goes. And they are speaking to management that, the management that is in place at MSNBC to ensure that we are still receiving what we should be receiving from our company, which is nice because communication is interesting right now in these interesting times.
Yeah, I certainly can imagine. Danielle, I want to come back to you. Stephanie just told us a lot about her role and her union, but for other people who are joining us tonight, how can journalists get involved in forming a union and leading their union? Can you tell us a little bit about how that process works?
Sure. So for one, journalists are very good at asking questions and analyzing issues. And that's also what unions need. So people who can look at a workplace and ask, what's going on here? And how can I make it better? And at the core of it is just talking to your coworkers so you can figure it out together. And while as journalists, you may be limited in your political advocacy and other outlets, the right to join or form a union is legally protected. And we also have committees within the union that allow people to drill down on certain workplace issues to take on an even larger role. So, for example, a lot of unions have diversity committees, health and safety committees, AI and new technology committees, and just other issues of concern where it's a way to advocate for yourself and your coworkers. You can also support bargaining when it's time for your contract to be negotiated, to join your bargaining committee or join a contract action team to help support actions in the workplace that can pressure management as you fight for your contract. You can do what Stephanie has done and become a union steward and help advocate for your peers. You can be an officer. And if you're in a newsroom that doesn't yet have a union, you can form one. So the most basic way to take part in that process is to get involved on the committee and start having conversations. And you all map out the workplace, you figure out who knows who, and you talk to people and you gauge their level of support and you help them see, okay, this is what we have now. This is worth fighting for, the potential to have a union and have more. And you bring people there, whether you get recognized by your employer to win your union or have to go through an election, you can be a part of that process. And again, the core of it is just talking to your coworkers. And you'll have a network of people that you are responsible for talking to throughout that process. And then once you win your union, you start planning a campaign to win your contract. And that can be a long, hard process. A lot of News Guild contracts have between 25 and 35 different articles that touch on different aspects of work. And we need members in the shop to help draft those because you all are most familiar with how things work and how things should work. So I know that's how things work in the News Guild and at the Writers Guild, SAG-AFTRA, NABET, some of the other media unions. I think it's similar structures where it's really up to members to get involved and make all of this happen.
That's really good information. Thank you so much. And I do want to go ahead and tell our audience before we continue that we're getting close to that time where we're going to be taking your questions. So please feel free to go ahead and start dropping those in the Q&A box. That would be super, super great. Next, I want to come to you, April, because Danielle kind of touched on a good point, which is that we as journalists are limited in what we can say publicly. And I know several of us are in the position that I'm in where we report on unions every single day, but we might also want to be a part of a union. I'm a member of our union here at the FT, the FTUS Guild, and I always have this question of, how vocal can I be in supporting us in our collective actions when I'm, later that day going to be calling both union leaders and employers that are not so excited about unions. So, how have you navigated that as you've been a leader at the Insider Union?
Yes, you definitely have to navigate that. And I would say even outside of unions, you have to do that in your job anyway. I'm a financial reporter, and I know when I covered markets and then even in my current role, I talk to people who have a range of political views. So I'm always aware of that as far as what I say publicly. But I think even outside of like any partisan things or anything that might be read as explicitly political, at the end of the day, it's just trying to have better conditions, a better working environment for you and your fellow journalists, so that you can do the best journalism possible. And I think that's something that anyone can get behind. So that's really what it is. As far as certain things, as participating in things, I know when I was at Business Insider, there were people who covered companies and especially companies that were dealing with labor movements like Amazon, for example. And there were people who were covering that, but were also stewards and very involved in our contract fight. So it is possible. So you may not be saying explicitly political things on the outside, but it's a matter of, okay, I am advocating for my colleagues and I am willing to speak up in that way.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I think it's also important to call out that, sources are only half of the people that we're worried about. I think a lot of us are also worried about our colleagues who we're maybe hoping are going to be our employers one day. So you've been on the job market since you were a union leader. How did your history with the Insider Union impact your job hunt?
I mean, as far as I know, I don't think it did really. No one brought up anything to me. And I know I did, of course, tweet things and participate in social media campaigns when Business Insider, when the union ramped up its push for a contract. There was definitely that, but I can't say it harmed me in any way. And I know even for my current role, they actually reviewed my social media posts to make sure there wasn't anything that they thought was concerning. So nothing came up there. I mean, as far as what people might think who may be employers, one thing to remember, and I think this comes up especially when people may be scared about being too vocal or too active in their union, is like, will I be punished by a manager? And even though it's, unions versus management is often how it's framed, like you're really talking about the very top of the company, the people who really have control over the conditions, and that's generally not your line editor. So that's one thing to consider. And then also a lot of these folks um, could have been in a union before, often were. So there's that. And a lot of people are sympathetic to what the union is fighting for and may support it. And some people said that explicitly to me in roles when I was in a union. Some people may not have felt that they could say it explicitly because they were managers, but you knew. So it's not necessarily a thing that, oh, I can't say something because a manager is going to ding me for that.
That is very good to hear. Before we go to our audience question and answer, I want to come back to you, Danielle, because I want to make sure that we're covering the questions and concerns of all the members of our NABJ family. So, freelancers, do they have any options for the type of advocacy and protections that you were just describing that those of us on staff might enjoy in a union?
So I'll start with a caveat that independent contractors are excluded from traditional US labor law because they're not classified as employees. But that doesn't mean that freelancers can't come together and push for improvements in the industry, particularly over like how they're treated and compensated. So there's a freelance journalist project that's part of the National Writers Union. Within the News Guild, our Bay Area local, the Pacific Media Workers Guild, has a freelance chapter. So those are two organizations where you can pay dues as a freelancer and help advocate for these issues that concern you and your ability to continue to get work and do your work. And even though traditional labor law doesn't necessarily apply, there are some jurisdictions that have legal protections for freelancers. So New York City has had the Free Act since 2016. And I think last year, the New York State passed a law to protect freelancers. Los Angeles has a city freelance worker protection ordinance. So there are some protections. Freelancers can definitely get involved and become members of organizations that allow them to advocate for themselves and have templates for how to, negotiate contracts and try to maintain standards to raise industry standards and not be pitted against other freelancers.
That is really good to know. Let's go ahead and transition to our Q&A. I have a couple of questions here. Let me go ahead and jump in to the first one. Danielle, you might want to go ahead and unmute because I think it's for you. Can unions help journalists find new employment once they've left their old place and help with some of that retaliation or non-compete agreements, that kind of thing?
So that is an issue where we are negotiating in many of our contracts to ban non-compete agreements because they are unfair in this industry. Frankly, I think they're unfair in most industries. So that is something that as we get that language in more contracts, will protect more people as they move around. And while we don't have an official like hiring hall where we can like place people into other newsrooms, the union is a network. And as people, just like NABJ, as you get to know people, it really can be an avenue to help you network and find other positions. And yeah, it's more having protections in place around limiting restrictions on hiring, promoting more equitable hiring. All of those things in contracts make it easier for folks to move from place to place, even though we don't officially have like a referral network.
Yeah,
Thanks. Go
oh,
ahead.
yeah, I'll just add that seconding Danielle's point that unions can be a great way to network as well. If you are a member of a union, I highly suggest attending the union meetings, both for your unit as well as your local, because one, it helps you stay informed so you're not like, oh, wait, this is happening. And then also, it's been a way that I've met a lot of people from other outlets. And I've ended up working with some people in other capacities later on. But yeah, it's a good way to expand your network.
Definitely. And I think we all know that getting that face time with people is the best, if not the only way to get jobs in this industry. So moving on to our next question, it reads, I feel as though my newspaper is attempting to keep me from knowing who my union reps are and how to get in touch with them. I'm new to the outlet, so what steps do I take to join my union and protect myself? Stephanie, you're a steward. I'm imagining you probably handle some of the new joiner outreach. What advice would you have for this person?
So I guess the most direct question, the most direct answer would be ask somebody. Turn to your neighbor and ask somebody. But seriously, uh, if you have any colleagues that you've clicked with, you say, hey, I know we're both part of the union. How do I make sure I'm part of that? And most anyone should be able to point you in the direction of, your local shop steward, who will then help you get enrolled in all the things that you need to know. Most depending on how your organization is set up, I mean, most shop stewards kind of like, we hear new people are coming in and they'll come and introduce themselves to you. But again, it's like these organizations are big and there are a lot of things going on right now. So sometimes, you got to help them out a little bit. But truly, if you find someone else who you work with, you can just turn to them and literally ask, hey, I know we're part of the union. What do I need to do in order to make sure that I'm enrolled properly? And can benefit from this organization. And then some kind soul, usually a shop steward, will get you the information that you need.
That's really great to know. Our next question, I can't believe I did not think of this one myself. It's the money question. How do dues work? Danielle, do you want to start with this one? And then I would love if Stephanie or April, you would jump in as well, since you all have paid dues. Tell us a little bit about how they work.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I want to start by saying that unions are not vending machines. It's not like you put money in and then you get the protections out. It is a membership organization, and your contract will be as strong as what you and your colleagues and the other members can fight for. So union dues are a piece of that. So most union dues are somewhere between 1% and 2% of your salary, just like other payroll deductions. They will come out of your check through, direct debit, and be transferred by your employer to your union. So unless some people choose to still write a paper check and mail it to their union, but that is very few and far between. But what that does is it covers overhead for your individual bargaining units, union resources. It also goes to your local to support the overhead for that. Some of it goes to the national. And then if your union is affiliated with a larger union, up to that level as well. And it supports things like new union organizing in other shops. It supports trainings for stewards and officers. I'm a union staffer, so obviously it would support my salary, and things like that. But it's to put resources in place so that unions can better advocate for their members. And if we all pool our money and collectively contribute, we get more from it. Unions require you to sign off an authorization so that the dues can be deducted from your pay. But again, it's a small percentage that comes out. Often you don't notice, and I can say I'm a union member myself, knowing that there are like protections against being unfairly fired. There's procedures in place if a layoff needed to happen. There's other guarantees in there. I think it's well worth it.
Sorry, I know you said one of us to jump in. I will say that being in two different unions, when I was at Reuters with the News Guild, yes, the money came straight out my check. Well, I started off as freelance, but I was still like, and I could join the union. It was complicated. But when I initially joined the union, I had to pay my dues until they got me into a position where it was coming out of my check. And then now that I'm at the Writers Guild, because we're still in the infancy stages after our contract being in place, we are actually being charged quarterly for our dues, and we have to like calculate them and send it to them, and then them debiting it from our check will be next year. So I will say Danielle's answer is obviously correct. She's a staffer, but I have lived through the variations. So but overall, someone will contact, someone has always contacted me about what these dues are in order for me to pay for them. And I pay them gladly, because who doesn't like protection?
I see. I'll just add that, and at least to my recollection, Danielle told me if I'm like making something up, hopefully not, but I know and this, I think this is something that works differently, union by union. But when I was at Business Insider, actually, before we were on contract, we did not pay dues. So that, once a contract was in place, then the unit members were charged dues. And I know one thing that I remember was part of the messaging and something we talked to people about is, yes, you will be paying dues, but what we're hoping to do is advocate and fight for raises that definitely exceed those. So it won't be like, oh, I'm actually making less. Like, obviously, that's not the point. But to ensure really strong raises that are definitely more than worth the dues that you're paying.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just add, from personal experience, our union is one of three unions at the FT, and they negotiate annual, cost of living increases that I think cover, if not exceed, um, our dues. And that is not something that I had when I worked in other newsrooms that were not unionized. So just a fun fact from me. And keep your questions coming. Our next question is, how do you manage the union responsibilities with the burnout that many journalists experience? That's a great question, because I think many of us are fatigued coming out of election season, right? So, Stephanie, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Manage responsibilities. I mean, quite honestly, I think it is. I mean, this might sound sappy. I'm not quite sure, but I actually think it's a help in order to speak with my colleagues about union issues. Coming off of the election coverage, it is help. One of the benefits I find with the union is that it is helpful to have this collective community, knowing that we are all feeling a lot of the same emotions and carrying a lot of the same worries. And then it is kind of like a balm to my soul in order to get the answer to these questions. Sometimes it's questions I don't even stop to think and ask myself, which is always really, really nice. There's something wonderful about being able to use this position to not only help protect me and my colleagues, but also to calm my my own nerves. Now, as far as like the burnout is concerned, I mean, I don't know. Like, I'll be completely honest. When are we not burned out at this point? This country is insane. But I think I think that I use this. I think I use this as a way to relieve some of my anxiety around my job. It is relaxing and helpful to me to know that if the worst happens and layoffs come, we have severance pay, and there's mechanisms in place rather, to ensure that the best things could happen in those situations. Someone can communicate with you early. You can start taking steps early. You just don't wake up one day and suddenly don't have a job. Like, that just doesn't happen. So yeah. And then also, I don't know about this, didn't happen to other unions, but as a member of the Writers Guild, right? we are part of, there's thousands of members, and members include people from like Hollywood, and we get like a lot of screeners and stuff, which is actually like, and there are a lot of events. And because this is November and award season is just around the corner, suddenly my inbox is flooded with things like for your consideration. So I'm invited to Wicked screenings right now, and Gladiator 2 screenings, and like, yes, please, Denzel. And I find those moments helpful with the burnout in such an odd way, because when I have these moments, and I'm just like, I can't do anything more, I can't read another, expose about this next cabinet pick, I will sit down and ignore the world with a screener from the WGA, and I am not ashamed to say that.
Well, Danielle, I was going to ask you if you could like give a breakdown of what the time commitment is, but now I'm also wondering, what perks does the News Guild offer? The WGA has film screenings. What can we expect in the News Guild?
It's hard to compete against that. So we got a lot of committees, but the commitment varies. I mean, if you're on a union organizing committee, I don't know if Stephanie or April want to talk to this. It's usually like weekly meetings plus the additional time that you spend talking to the people that have been assigned to you as your contacts. So at certain points, it might just be a couple of hours a week. As things pick up towards the end, you might be going 10 hours a week just on union stuff. So it really depends on what phase of the campaign you're in. And then once your union's in place, if you are an officer, you will probably have monthly meetings for your unit, monthly meetings for your local, plus other responsibilities that come up day to day. But again, it might just be a few hours per week. Some weeks you might not really have anything. If you're negotiating the contract on the bargaining committee, bargaining sessions could go all day. And towards the end, they can be marathons. So you might get days in a row, plus all the prep that goes into drafting the language and being ready to actually negotiate against your employer. So that is a big time commitment. And what we try to do in most of our shops is get something called release time, so that you are excused from some of your work responsibilities, or your workload can be adjusted to account for time in bargaining. Not every employer agrees to that. So some people are doing their full-time day-to-day work duties with union things on top. For a steward, again, you have your regular meetings, and then you might just get called in to represent someone. It could be a 30-minute meeting where you sit with someone. You might need to prep with them for a little bit beforehand. So it really depends. But I would say generally it's like a couple of hours a week, if that. Again, some weeks are slower and you don't have anything. But you can always make it more. I know some union members who join every committee because they're like, I'm a part of something and I want to make this better. And you become friends with some of your colleagues, and like it really feels like a space that you want to be a part of. So we welcome people to commit as much as they can to the union movement. There's a lot of like evening meetings, which can be hard. I have a toddler, so sometimes that schedule is hard. But for folks who can make it work, it's generally well worth it.
I just
Definitely.
wanted
Go ahead, April.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to chime in and say, yeah, the commitment is what you make it. And you don't necessarily have to be an officer or a steward in order to be involved. You can ramp up your commitment, time permitting with your beat. I know there's some people whose beat is around the clock, and so there's only so much they can do, but they show up for if there are actions. I know at Business Insider, when we were fighting for our contract and there were certain actions that we were taking, there were people who made sure they participated in it. And we were also cognizant to make sure we did things that were low lifts for people, like send this message, versus higher lifts, like help us organize, like help us set up certain things. So there's that. And also another thing I'll say is, especially if you're in a union, is the more people who are stewards or who are part of committees, like the less work there is for everyone. So that's a big part of it too. Like, so we're always encouraging people to get involved because it's like, okay, that makes it easier for these things to happen, and it's not such a burden for everyone.
Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. Our next question is another really, really big one. I'd love to hear everyone's take on this, actually. Um, and it is, can unions stop us from being replaced by AI? Who wants to go first?
Okay, hi. I realized I didn't have to raise my hand like that. But anyway, um, I'm speaking from the WGAE standpoint, mostly because not that I was part of this action when this was happening. I was very much, we were still very much doing our own contract with it with MSNBC. However, the Hollywood strike is a really good example of what a union can do to protect you from AI. Point blank and period. Those writers, those actors, we saw this huge movement. Some of us covered it. This past summer, the following summer, I don't know, what is time? But we saw this huge action. All these people in the streets fighting to protect their jobs and to have the union protect their jobs and to put protections in place from this very technology, so that they're not the writers aren't replaced by AI, so the actors aren't replaced by AI, so performers aren't replaced by AI, vocally or otherwise. And while it has taken some back and forth negotiations, I do believe that these contract negotiations that they now have in place have really put great protections in place for that development of AI technology. But again, like Danielle was saying before, I believe it was Danielle who was saying it before, your contract is largely negotiated by the people who are in the newsroom, right? It's negotiated by your wants and the things that more or less scare you, right? If you're interested in a pension, that's what you're fighting for. This is something that you should fight for. This is something that you should discuss and talk to your colleagues about, how this could actually replace you in the newsroom. But from a Stephanie standpoint, with the Writers Guild of America, yes, they can't stop us from being replaced by AI, but they can put protections in place for as long as we are under contract with their unions and our organizations in order to keep that at bay for as long as we can.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, April.
Oh, okay. Yes, I was just gonna say at Business Insider, this was definitely something we brought up in the bargaining, because the editor-in-chief at the time was very bullish on AI and like wrote a memo about how the newsroom was going to use AI, and so was definitely brought, we knew that it was something that needed to be addressed. I believe what happened in the end was that they agreed to a working committee so that people in a newsroom, reporters, would be involved in whatever policy they put forth for it. So it wasn't just something that was unilaterally imposed. But yes, to Stephanie's point, I mean, it's something that, it speaks to the importance of getting people involved and really fighting for things in your contract, because that will be the way to address it.
Yeah, Stephanie and April are both completely correct. It's what you fight for and what you can win will determine the level of protection, but this is a big issue for folks. For the News Guild, I sit on our like national AI committee, so I get to help draft model language around this and see what different newsrooms are winning in their contracts. And it's hard because employers, they want to be able to use the technology, especially as it improves. Some of the corporate chains that own newsrooms that haven't been legacy media companies, they don't have the same commitment to protecting journalism. So we have seen a range of language, some that are as broad as there shall be no limitations on the use of AI, which is just scares me. But others that say that journalists and other employees cannot be laid off as a result of implementing AI, and any new technology, including AI, can be supplemental to the work and can be a tool used by journalists, but it shall not replace their work. We have some contracts that require publishers to put a note in the byline if AI was used in drafting or editing of articles or in producing images. Um, we have some contracts that say that in order for AI to be allowed, there have to be clear standards that are communicated to everyone so that no one can get disciplined for not using it appropriately if they didn't know. So there are a range of ways to try to protect against it. It's very rare that we can win a contract that says you cannot be laid off as a result, but we have it. We have done it. And those are really powerful. There are others where there are provisions that if someone is laid off, or if AI is introduced in a way that can reduce the number of jobs, that some of them say you can get retrained to another open position and have alternatives to lay off. Others allow for enhanced severance. So beyond just additional severance pay, if you're laid off, you get even more money on top of it. Just because we know as this technology improves, it is a real concern, but it'll never replace good journalism. And how can you hold it accountable? Journalists have a duty. You follow ethical guidelines, and AI doesn't. And I know journalists are really protective of their sources and really make sure that they are relying on credible sources. And we know AI is not there yet. So I think this is a huge issue that we really need to fight for. So every time I see it come up in a union contract, I'm just happy when they can win protections against it.
Well, Danielle, obviously, I really agree with that last part about how we could not be replaced by AI. But if I could just add, one note from my own reporting, there are other unions outside of the media industry that have also negotiated for retraining and enhanced severance. I think you mentioned that. Should your job be eliminated due to AI or other automation or technology, like the employer is required to either place you in a new role or train you for a new role. So that is also an option that can be folded into contracts. And I think will be a big topic of conversation for all of us as we renegotiate our contracts in the coming years. But with that being said, I want to go ahead and ask one final question. This is for all of our panelists. So if we could just kind of go down the line. We've shared a lot about our own experiences in newsrooms, or for you, Danielle, for working with journalists. There's a lot of chaos in this industry. I think we've all kind of said that forming or joining a union is one solution. I'm wondering, do any of you have other things you would like to see changed in our industry that could provide all of us with more stability and more certainty when it comes to the direction of our careers as journalists? So, Stephanie, do you want to start?
I need to think for a moment. Can I pass to April? April always has really good answers. Now I'm gonna think.
Sorry, I put you all on the spot.
Yeah, this is a big one. I mean, I think it's just being given the tools that we need to do our jobs most effectively. I know obviously there's the business model at most places is still really being worked out. And at some places, it's been like churning out as much content as you can. That's not really working, we're finding. And so I think the solution will be like, how do we provide what is most valuable to our audiences? And I think unions are a really big piece of that because reporters know what tools they need to do their jobs best. And that's what we're advocating for with many of these protections. I mean, pay is a big piece of it, but it's not just that. It's really like putting the conditions in place that allow us to do our best work. And we know that because we're talking to people in our communities, we're talking to sources who are also in many cases our audience. And so we're speaking to them directly, we know. And so the good thing about unions, the really powerful thing is it gives us a voice so we can really advocate for those things.
Yeah, definitely, April. You kind of took my answer right out of my mouth, which is training and educational tools, educational opportunities. I think that is a really big thing that can help insulate us against change in this industry. I know prioritizing continuing education is a career goal of mine. Danielle, is the answer for you just unions all the way?
Well, unions can advocate for legislative protections, including things that might lead to more funding for the media industry. At the top, Taylor, you mentioned some of the layoffs and closing of newsrooms that we've seen as the business model has shifted away from people buying physical papers and having to rely on more digital subscribers as advertising revenue decreases. Places are going under. We're seeing more news deserts. Um, so if there's a way to get public funding for good journalism and to maintain standards, so it's not just up to corporate owners who rely on things like AI and call themselves journalists. So I think just better standards, and I agree with you and April as well in terms of education and just advocacy within your own workplace as well.
Stephanie, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh God. I do believe that April and Danielle are 100% 100% correct, and I can't add more to that. I will say that an outside force that I think might be happening now that will actually help us a lot. It's just a cultural shift in America, right? There has been something that has been happening in America in the last, like, I don't know, at least our generation, where with this de-emphasis on truth and on journalism itself. And I think that this election is going to be the reckoning that a lot of Americans need to understand that, social media is fun, but it is not a source for your information, and that they need to come back to their traditional forms of media, whether that's a newspaper, a magazine, or good old PBS. I think that journalism can save us if they use us like the tool that we're meant to be. And there's a reason why the Fourth Estate is protected, in the Constitution. There's a reason for it. So, that's what I think ultimately save us all. But what Danielle and April said, they're actual actionable things.
Well, Stephanie, I certainly hope you're right. I hope we'll see an influx of new readers and viewers in the next couple of years, a second Trump bump, as you will. But we are out of time. I do really, really want to take a moment to thank each of our phenomenal panelists for being here with us this evening. Stephanie, Danielle, April, this has been so helpful. I know I've learned a lot of things about how I can take better advantage of my union, maybe even a few things to ask sources about when I cover their unions. I also want to thank the NABJ webinar team for setting all this up for us. It's been really great to be here and connect with you all. And with that, I will let you get back to your night. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you all soon.